ever been deep inside a novel, completely lost in its world, when suddenly something pulled you out? A detail that felt wrong, a passage that read like a textbook, a moment where you stopped being a reader and started being a critic. That moment is the sound of a contract being broken. Today we're going to talk about how to research fiction without killing the story. Whether you're working on a historical thriller, a medical drama, or a novel set in a culture you've never lived in, the principles are the same. And they begin with something I want to call the authenticity contract. Let's start there. When a reader picks up your novel, they extend you a form of trust. They agree to inhabit your world. They agree to follow your characters. They agree to feel what the story needs them to feel. But that trust rests on a single assumption. The assumption is that you, the writer, know what you're talking about well enough that the reader never gets pulled out of the story by something that rings false. That's the contract. And here's the crucial part. You don't have to be an expert in everything your story touches. You have to be authentic enough that expertise is never missed. Those are different obligations. Confusing them is where almost every research failure begins. There are two ways to break this contract. The first is under-researching. A wrong detail. A firearm that can't do what your character uses it for. A legal procedure that doesn't actually work the way your plot requires. A period, inaccurate object sitting in an 1840s parlor. That kind of error pulls the expert reader out of the story immediately. And it quietly damages the trust of every other reader who senses something is off without knowing why. The second way to break the contract is over-researching. The writer who spent 3 months learning everything about Civil War field surgery and cannot bear to leave any of it out delivers authenticity as punishment. The reader is no longer in the story. They're in a lecture. The research becomes a wall between the reader and the experience the story should be delivering. So the craft challenge is not how to research. The craft challenge is how to know what your story needs, acquire exactly that, and then get out of the way. Now let's talk about what actually needs research. Because not everything does. A contemporary novel set in a suburb you know firsthand, among people whose professional and cultural world you inhabit, may need almost no research at all. A historical thriller set in Ottoman Constantinople requires sustained, layered work before you write a single word of the draft. Most projects fall somewhere between those two extremes. Research needs tend to fall into 7 recognizable categories. Let's walk through them. The first is factual research. History, science, law, medicine, military procedure. This is where most writers think first. And it matters. But here's something worth knowing. It is not the category most likely to make or break the reading experience. Readers forgive minor historical imprecision more readily than they forgive sensory or psychological falseness. The second category is environmental. Geography, climate, architecture, the physical feel of a place. A story set in a city you've never visited needs this work urgently. A story set in your own neighborhood needs almost none. The third category is cultural. Customs, social norms, class dynamics, religious practice, the unspoken rules that govern a community's behavior. This category is among the most dangerous to get wrong, and among the most rewarding to get right. Why? Because culture is what characters take for granted. When you have absorbed it deeply enough, your characters take it for granted too, and the reader feels the world as lived in rather than constructed. The fourth category is technical and professional. The tradecraft of specific professions, technologies, crafts, and skills. A character who is a surgeon, a locksmith, a ship's navigator, a glassblower. They need to move through their work with competence. You don't need to be able to perform the surgery yourself. You need to know enough about how it is done that the character's hands know what they're doing. The fifth category is sensory. Smell, taste, sound, texture. This category is systematically underserved by most writers because it does not come from books. What does a ship's engine room smell like? What does period-accurate food actually taste like? What is the ambient sound of a cotton mill in 1910? Sensory research requires different methods. Interviews, site visits, oral histories, documentary footage. The payoff is disproportionate to the effort because sensory accuracy is what makes a world viscerally real. The sixth category is psychological. The interior landscape of trauma, mental illness, grief, addiction, obsession. Fiction that enters a character's psychological reality without adequate research produces the most immediately recognizable falseness. It reads like someone describing a condition from the outside, instead of living it from the inside. The seventh category is linguistic. Dialect, register, period-accurate idiom, the specific vocabulary of professions and communities. And let me be clear about what this does not mean. It does not mean phonetically rendered dialect, which most contemporary readers find exhausting. It means the rhythms, the idioms, and the embedded assumptions of how people in a specific time and place actually spoke. Now that we've mapped the categories, let's go deeper into the two failure modes. Because understanding how research goes wrong is how you keep your own work from falling into either trap. The first failure mode is the wrong detail. The under-researched story contains errors that break the authenticity contract. Some are immediately visible to readers with relevant expertise. A surgeon reading a medical thriller where the procedure is anatomically impossible. A gun owner reading a thriller where the firearm behaves in ways no firearm can. A historian reading a novel where a period detail is decades out of place. Here's what most writers miss. These errors do not stay isolated. A single bad detail does not just break one moment in your book. It contaminates the reader's relationship with everything that follows. Because if that detail was wrong, what else might be wrong? The reader reads differently after a trust breach. More skeptically. With less of the surrendered attention that fiction requires to do its work. And here's the most important point about wrong details. The most dangerous ones are not the ones you know are uncertain. Those get checked. The most dangerous ones are the confident errors. The assumptions you believe are true and never think to verify. Let me give you a concrete example. A common confident error. Writers who believe a gun silencer produces the near-silent sound you hear in film and television. In reality, an actual suppressor reduces a gunshot to somewhere around 130 decibels. Still loud. Still unmistakable. The gap between writer assumption and reality is wide enough to pull any reader who knows firearms straight out of the story. So the lesson here is to interrogate your confident knowledge as carefully as your uncertain knowledge, especially when it comes from movies and television. Now let's look at the second failure mode, the research delivery. The over-researched story contains everything the writer learned, delivered to the reader whether they need it or not. You spent 3 months learning about 18th century shiprigging. And by God, the reader is going to learn about it too. But here's the key insight. This is not a research problem. It is a prose problem. The research is done. The failure is in deployment. So how do you decide what stays on the page? Every fact you include needs to earn its place through one of two criteria. Either it is essential to the reader's understanding of what happens next, or it delivers atmosphere and texture that serves the reading experience. If a detail meets neither test, it belongs in your notes, not in your manuscript. The most visible form of this failure is the info dump. The long expository block that stops the story while the writer installs the world. But there's a subtler version that's equally damaging. The story that is technically accurate at every point, but reads as a documentary rather than a lived experience. Because every research detail has been included, and the selection pressure that makes prose feel necessary has been abandoned. Every fact you include needs to earn its place through one of two criteria. Either it is essential to the reader's understanding of what happens next, or it delivers atmosphere and texture that serves the reading experience. If a detail meets neither test, it belongs in your notes, not in your manuscript. The model for getting this right is Patrick O'Brian's Master and Commander novels. O'Brian clearly knows more about 18th century naval life than any reasonable reader will ever absorb. But almost none of that knowledge is delivered directly. It arrives through the experience of characters who take it entirely for granted. In the things they notice, in the things that are never explained, because to the people living that life, no explanation is needed. That is research deployed correctly. So let's pull this all together. Here is how to research fiction without killing the story. First, remember the authenticity contract. You owe the reader a world that never rings false. You do not owe them a demonstration of everything you learned. Second, identify which of the 7 categories your story actually depends on. Factual, environmental, cultural, technical, sensory, psychological, linguistic. Most stories lean heavily on 2 or 3. Put your effort there. Third, pay special attention to sensory and psychological research. These are the categories where falseness is most quickly felt and most rarely forgiven. Fourth, interrogate your confident assumptions. The errors that hurt your book most are the ones you never thought to check. Fifth, when you sit down to write, apply the deployment test to every research detail. Does this fact serve the reader's understanding of what happens next? Does it deliver atmosphere that serves the experience? If not, leave it in your notes. And finally, aim for the O'Brien standard. Let your characters take their world for granted. Let knowledge arrive through what they notice and what they never have to explain. Because the goal of research is not to prove you did it. The goal of research is to disappear. To make a world so lived in that the reader simply walks into it and forgets, for a few hundred pages, that anyone built it at all. That is the contract. That is the craft. And that is how you research fiction without killing the story. The Power Tool. The companion Power Tool for this masterclass covers the full research taxonomy in detail, the 2 failure modes with extended analysis and examples, the complete selection principle, voice and POV considerations, ethics and representation in research, and 4 targeted exercises. It is a free download at fictionbrain.com. Everything on the site is free. No paywall, no subscription. Just craft, ready when you need it.